Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today was a journalist, a public relations man, a newspaper publisher. He was chief of staff to former Premier Clyde Wells, but most of us know and love him for the work he did for so many years with the Gower Community Band. His name is Edsel Bonnell, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the program, Edsel.
Pleasure to be here, Karl. Thank you for the introduction. Sounds like I was a man who couldn't hold a job.
No, you very much could hold a job. You had so much talent and ability, you had to spread it around. Tell me, you were a teenager during Confederation, the great battle for Confederation. Yes. Which side were you on? Were you for Confederation or against Confederation?
Well, at 14, you hardly know what side you're on. It could be anything, but basically, I was, I guess I had an environment of being for Confederation. My folks were not from St. John's, and my dad especially grew up in Lamoline and left it early enough to be able to make a living, but it was just terrible. And in the days of when the fishermen were virtually indentured, and you know, if you made $200 a year, that was good, but you didn't make it because you had to take it up at the merchant store and that kind of thing, you know. It's truck system, as they called it. So all these people, and, you know, as Mr. Smallwood used to say, you know, Her Majesty's outpost government, they were pretty strong Confederates. They wanted to get rid of the old responsible government system. So I was, now as a matter of fact, I was also in Prince Wales College at that time, and in grade 8, I guess 9, I guess, remember. Anyway, we used to have, we had a debating society up there. We were encouraging debate. And I did a fair amount of debating, learned how to do it, and so on and so forth. And I remember we had a monumental debate on Confederation. And I happened to be on the pro side, you know. Now, if I was on the anti side, I still had to have a good debate, but I was on the pro side. And I think I remember especially, I can't remember who the opposition were, but except one, Chris Pratt. He was in my class, and he was debating as well. So we had a lot of fun. The pro side won, by the way, but I got a feeling that may have had something to do with the fact that the facilitator was Phil Forsey, who was my pre-teacher up there. And of course, he later became the Honorable Phil Forsey in Smallwood's first government. He was a pretty strong Confederate.
After Confederation, say a year or two after Confederation, was there a big difference in Newfoundland?
Oh my goodness, unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable. You see, the difference really started in 1939, you know, with the outbreak of the war, and when all the troops, came into Newfoundland, that changed the economy, because people were finally getting paid. Laborers building, I think they had something like 20,000 people working for the Americans. They all got American money and good money, but so that helped there. So the Newfoundland was no longer poor, but all the old structures were virtually gone. I mean, the merchants didn't own everything. Mainland companies started to come in and so on and so forth, and cars. We even started to drive on the left. On the right instead of the left.
So we drove on the left before Confederation.
Yes, and in fact, there was a great story about that, because one of the anecdotes was that the discussion that was held at City Hall, I believe, because St. John's was the only place that mattered. One of the councillors said, "Look, I'm not sure we should do this way. Why don't we phase it in?" Can you imagine phasing in, switching from one lane to the other? A lot of accidents.
You got to do it all at the same time.
Yeah.
Now, you had your early education at the Salvation Army College.
College, yeah.
What kind of education was that? And is that where the seed of music was planted?
Well, not so much on the music, but well, apparently. But it was my education there was I suppose astonishing, considering the facility. The facility was down there. It's torn down now for long ago. It's but I mean, there was that old big stone building on the corner of Springdale and whatever, George Street or whatever it was. But I mean, it was just terrible. There were no facilities, there was no labs, there was no gymnasium to talk about, and you couldn't get. So my dad, who, as it happened, ended up being he was a great believer in education because he couldn't get an advanced one himself down in Lameline, had to come out of it. But he was chairman of the Salvation Army School Board. And he took my sister and my older sister, Ina, and I, out of the Salvation Army College when they began to build, Booth Memorial, it became. And he was still school board when they opened up Booth Memorial. He did that because it sent us both to Prince of Wales, my sister at commercial and so on, and I all of a sudden had a chance to go to chemistry labs and physics and things like that, and languages and all the rest of it, French, Latin, everything else. So I didn't really stay there. I stayed there till grade 6, and then went to Prince of Wales, But the teachers did an amazing job. There were only a few there, but they didn't have the facilities to offer advanced music. You mentioned music, and that's one thing we did do. We did have a lot of people, who would like singing classes and stuff like that. But really, I was already playing music certainly before I went to Prince of Wales, because again, my dad and mom were convinced that their children should have music, and Ina, in fact, was a fine pianist. She became the accompanist for the songsters and so on at the Salvation Army Temple till she died. I went to learn, and she taught me a little bit of music first, like how to play the piano. I could play by ear, but I couldn't play by note. So she sent me up to a man called Harvey Cousins, who was an amazing man, very handicapped. He had a problem with his spine, I think an injury, which only made him more 3.5 or 4 feet tall, and small hands. He could play magnificently, not only the piano, but the marimba phone and everything else. And he taught me not only theory and music, but he taught me the love of music. And so much so that even as a child of 6, 7, 8, he would invite me up after hours, and to a night of music. And I'd sit there and we'd listen to classical records, all on the old 12 or 15-inch ones, 78. And so if a symphony would have to be like 6 or 7 records, and in between you'd have to crank it up. We didn't even have an electric phonograph. But it was, I developed a love of music, and that's what it takes. And I tried to impart that on everybody I was connected with ever since. And I one of the things I used to always tell people in the band, don't play the notes, play the music. Big difference, big difference. It's a passion,
So you went into journalism and you worked for the Evening Telegram. This was back in the days of the Herders.
Absolutely.
Harold Horwood, Michael Harrington.
Absolutely.
The Telegram was quite the paper back then.
It was the paper.
It was the paper in the 1950s.
Still isn't that?
1950s.
It's the only paper.
Well, it's the only paper now. But in the 1950s, 60s, it was really a very good quality paper, solid journalism. Just talk about the Telegram of that time and what you did there.
Well, I went to the Telegram in the fall of 1952 after a very ignominious year at Memorial. I went there for a year up to the old college on Parade Street. So they didn't have much either. You could be a teacher, or you could have a general arts course, or you could be an engineer, and I went into engineering, and I was not meant to be an engineer. I have great respect for them. We need them, but I was not one of them. I was more esoteric, I suppose, or ethereal or whatever. But I wanted to write. I wanted to enjoy music and all this kind of stuff, and so when I left, I had no sense going back to Memorial because I felt I had just go make a living. And I went down, I saw an ad in the Evening Telegram. I had done some youth correspondence with them, in writing a little bit and so on. And I went down and applied for the job. It was for a sports reporter. And Steve Herder, you remember Steve Herder?
Yes, I do.
He's a magnificent man and a newspaperman to the core, And I went in, and he wrote a rather gruff type and everything else. But he interviewed me, and he said, "You're applying for the job. What could I do? I got my education, so on and so forth and so on." And then he came down and said, "Okay, so how are you local sports scene? How are you up on sports?" I said, "I don't know anything about it." He said, "What?" He said, "I don't know anything much about sports. I mean, I watch, or listen to NHL on Hockey Night in Canada, and I used to hear the baseball games and the World Series on shortwave, but I was not a sport. I just wasn't, okay, no good at it." And he said, what did you apply for the job for?" I said, "Because I want to get into newspaper. I want to get into writing. And I figured if you give me the job, I'd learn sports, and then maybe I could switch somewhere else." To his everlasting credit, Steve said, he looked at me and a grin came across his face. He said, "You got a job, but it's not in sports." I said, "Okay." So he took me on in the newsroom, and I was under his wing. And I started writing, and and then I also he got me into editing and so on and so forth. And within a year and a half, I was an editor, a news editor at the Telegram, and all the foreign news and all that kind of stuff, and also doing a lot of layout. And at that time, Steve was determined to bring the Telegram into the 20th century, if nothing else, because we were still, you remember the old, if you ever go to the files and see old telegrams, there's hardly any news, there's ads on the front page and stuff like that. And it wasn't a matter of newspaper. Anyway, we changed typefaces, we did everything, and we went from there. But the people at that time, Karl, were incredible. I'm very grateful with the career I've had, because in the time span. Because you mentioned Harold Horde, he was there. An incredible writer, as you well know, and a fearless columnist. And he had left the small government at that point in time, and was a real thorn in their side. Ray Guy inherited the legacy from Harold Horwood, but he was fearless, and the Telegram were true newspaper people. They're one of them, because as a result of his writings and his criticisms and everything else, the Telegram lost every single bit of government advertising. Okay, they were very sooky about it, as we used to say. The herders never flinched. I mean, no matter how much they lost, journalism, the freedom of the press, was first and foremost. And it stood them in good stead, because the people out there, the readers, they appreciated that. And it was a wild time. Well, we had a lot of other people too. Remember, Ron Pumphrey was there, Don Morris, Sylvia Wigg, who you would remember,
who did theater reviews,
women's editor, and so on. And
she also did theater reviews, didn't she? And upset the people of the London Theatre Company because of her reviews.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that, because I was a great fan. When I said I was ethereal before, when I was young in school, I went to every one. I was an addict of London Theatre. And in fact, the Alexandra Players, who were the first ones that came here. Right. London Theatre followed the next day. And all the people that came here with those,
John Holmes.
Pardon me?
John Holmes.
Holmes, that's right. John Holmes, I thought.
Leslie Yeoh was the...
And Leslie Yeoh and so on and so forth, and Hilary Vernon, and it goes on and on. But, you're right, and Sylvie was part of that whole thing. And
yes.
Like, St. John's was starting to come alive in terms of, we had live theatre, but not live professional theatre. It was all amateur stuff and good stuff. But, I mean, it was just great. And that was the element that we're in the newspaper business. There were exciting things happening politically and every other time. So I learned a lot, and the money wasn't very good. My starting salary was $25 a week, but other than that, it was okay.
It still isn't that great, Edsel.
No.
You had your own column at one point, didn't you?
It was called, that's right, it was called, very simple, Much Ado, ... ellipses, and it was simply that. It was miscellany, as they say. It was bits and pieces of everything, very much like in the Telegram now, the cheers and jeers type of thing, But it was Much Ado by Ed. Never even used my last name at that time, and Edsel, nobody knew me as Edsel, so I got the name Ed, and that was it. But I mean, it was a lot of fun, and I still got some copies of it at home and everything.
So eventually, you went into to radio for sure, maybe television. It was CJON, CBC,
that's
VOCM, right?
Yeah.
That must have been a huge contrast from working in print.
It was. And I got out, and there was no rancor involved. In fact, I felt bad about leaving the Telegram. I mean, they were very good to me, and I enjoyed that. But I knew a lot about print journalism and layout and publishing and everything else. But the electronic media, CBC or TV wasn't here yet. But CJON radio was, and there was a job opening up there, and I went up there, and of course, right off the bat, I more than doubled my salary. It was fantastic, because one thing about CJON, they were paying decent money for their journalists. But anyway, I went up there, and it was a tremendous experience, because all of a sudden, as you well know, it's a different style of writing. I mean, you could sit in the Telegram, you sit down and write a background piece and so on and so forth that would go on for a couple of thousand words maybe. No. Everything had to be, like 50, 60, 70 words, because a 5-minute newscast had to have about 8 stories in it, So you had to learn to that. You had to learn how to write concisely and so on, and clearly, and monosyllabically, I guess if there is such a word. But yeah, I learned a lot up there. Bren Walsh, do you remember Bren Walsh?
I remember Bren, yes,
Walsh,
I worked with Bren,
great
yeah.
man. And he was up at the time riddled with rheumatoid arthritis and everything. But he was a great man and a lot of fun. But the deadlines were terrible. I remember if you had the early morning shift up at CJON radio, you went and you had to start at 6 o'clock. So you had to be there, like say 4:45 to get ready. And that 6 o'clock news, 5-minute news, was left from the guy previous, went out at midnight. That was okay. But they had to have another newscast, 5 minutes at 7:30, another one at 8, another one at 8:30, and another one at 9. And by that time, you were a basket case, but they all had to be different, unless there was a major story like Water Street burning down. But everything else had to be. So people had to have contacts beforehand and try to drag them out and come up with a fresh 5-minute bulletin every 5 minutes, every half hour. Wow! But it taught you a lot. It taught you how to write quickly and effectively.
And then in 1956.
Yeah.
You decided, I'm going to start my own magazine.
Yep.
It was called Here in Newfoundland.
Well, it was a little bit ahead of myself on that one. It was I was at CJON, and then I went back to the Telegram for a couple of years, and because they were expanding, and I had a little more response, a little more money, and so on, But then the television arrives, and of course I knew people from television. I couldn't resist it. So CJON. So we went up there. It was before CBC, but I went back up there and had a real good job. I had a newsroom again, but I was on camera and I was on this and I was on that, and in fact, I guess the highlight of my of my journalism thing was in 1959, but I'm ahead of that. I'll go with 1956 because that's where you are. And I went back to the Telegram after about a year or two at CJON Radio, and they were buying the Western Star and so on and so forth. And we had a whole challenge, you know, in that respect. And Steve Herder had to go to the West Coast and sort of revamp the Western Star and so on. Well, I stayed in St. John's, and I was his alter ego here, and we worked ourselves to death, literally. And in 1956, 1955, Christmas, 1955, I collapsed. I was out playing in the band, Salvation Band, and serenading for Christmas, and the day before Christmas Eve. And I went back and I just collapsed. I never got up out of bed. I had bulbar polio, okay? Mm-hmm. So, and this was when, at the very time that the vaccine, I'm a strong believer in vaccines, but I didn't have it. But it had just eradicated polio, but unfortunately I got the last couple of germs, where I don't know, and my system, and I was paralyzed in the throat and lungs, breathing and all this kind of stuff, mouth, had to learn to talk over again, all that kind of stuff. But I mean, it was knocked me out. I was out of commission down at the Fever Hospital for more than 2 months. When I finally got back, I was learning how to walk and learning how to talk and so on, and I decided that I had to change my life. I said, I can't go on like this. In fact, I was told by the doctors, you're overworked, you know, you can't stand that kind of pace and all the rest of it. So I went back and I said, I talked to Steve about it, and he was very good and very sorry about it and all the rest of it, but, you know, and they had to move on. And in the meantime, I had been toying with the idea of having a magazine, you know, not in competition with the Telegram, but a monthly magazine that, you know, would be sort of a different thing, a more creative thing. And I was going to do it and stay at the Telegram, but then I left the Telegram, so I said, well, why can't I do that anyway? Not much work in that. Hello. Anyway, I did, and a fellow who worked with me at the Telegram, he came on to sell ads and so on. I was the editor and publisher and everything else. But again, it was a dream, and I kept it going for a couple of years, 58 or so. But it couldn't last. I just couldn't make money at it. You make money, but you make a living, you know.
Yeah.
And then I went back into CGON.
Right.
And I was back in CGON at 58, and still trying to pay off my bills from
what
magazine,
happened in 59?
Here in Newfoundland. And in 1959, I was had the opportunity. I had the assignment to go out and cover the IWA strike.
Wow!
And that was the most incredible part, I suppose, of my whole life, because I happened to be the only Newfoundland reporter out there all the time. CGON had a CGON TV at that time. Don Jameson was there, the great Don Jameson, and they were thinking big time at that time. You know, even before CBC was on the go, and they decided to send me out. It's very much like you're doing all these reporters down to Afghanistan for CNN, you know. And every other reporter came and went. He'd come out and see how I was on to go over there. I was there for the whole thing. I was there for the Badger Ride. I was there for the vigilantes in the community of Grand Falls and so on and so forth. It was unbelievable.
Were you there?
And it was scary.
Were you there when Constable Moss was killed?
Yeah, not. I wasn't there when he got killed.
Yeah, no.
But I was there an hour later. So I was in Grand Falls doing some stories, and I got back as soon as I got word that guy had a car, had a rented car, and all the rest of it, and we lived in hotels. But everybody else came out when in addition to doing stories for TV every night with a camera. I have an old camera, and doing regular reports during the day, usually 3, certainly 2, you know, and again, that was done by phone and so on and so forth. But I also had to write, you know, a weekly synopsis and so on, and background piece for the Sunday Herald, and And when if Canadian Press, was there for a while and used to room with me sometimes, guy Ian McDonald, but he'd have to go back because at the time, of course, Premier Smallwood was having this tremendous racket in the House, and expelling, the IWA. There was a lot on the go. Well, it was an incredible experience, and one I'll never forget. But it was terrible, and there was we ended up, because of the people who were so inflamed in Grand Falls, and starting like after the riot. I mean, they destroyed, for example, the IWA headquarters when Bill Moss came back and his body in the train. And I was there, but I put my up. I got out as fast as I could and hid my camera. I wasn't going to take a chance. I just couldn't, because that night after that, I remember we were placed under RCMP. Any media who were there at that time, some of the guys from the Toronto Star and so on and so forth, and we were placed under RCMP guard, who took over the old staff house for the media. Scary stuff.
And so we're out of time.
Oh.
We've only gotten through a portion of your story.
Okay,
Would you
sorry.
come back for another half hour?
Oh, I certainly can,
Okay.
but I apologize.
That's fine. No, you don't need to apologize.
I apologize.
Your stories were great.
I'll stop talking.
That's it for this edition of Karl Wells Point to Point. We'll be back next time, hopefully with Edsel. Thank you.